So now we would like to call upon Liang to share his conduct his sharing session on optimization of residential buildings. Liang, all yours.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for joining into this talk. Good evening to everybody. So this optimization of residential buildings is actually my master's thesis. And so back when I was a master's student, my key objective is just to have fun and then try to explore how much I can use data to design residential buildings. So it all began with this question, what is the relationship between designers and machines? If we prioritize too much on the designer, then we could be seen as too much of a necessity, and then we might have unfulfilled potential in terms of what we can design. However, if you flip it around, then there could be uncontrolled design and the human might become unnecessary. So my key objective was to have a balance so the humans can provide the qualitative aspect of design and the computers will handle the calculations. So I tried to apply this logic to residential building in Singapore. And if you look at the Singapore's climate, it's tropical and humid. So it presents some contrasting climate considerations. So in terms of the sun, if we let in too much sun, it might create a very hot space, whereas it might give us very good daylighting potential. And on the other hand, if we let in too much wind, it might feel more comfortable, but at the same time, it might also let in a lot of the rain. So I think there are some local vernacular that actually tries to deal with this contrast. So there's the Malay vernacular housing where you have the steep roofs that tries to encourage natural ventilation, direct the rainwater away from the living spaces. You have the shop house which lets in light through the light well, and you have the 5-foot way which protects pedestrians from the more harsh climate. So what I did was to study all these little geometry trends, and I tried to scale it up with higher density. So in this slide on the right, are just some of the geometrical trends that I tried to incorporate when I add it to the computational model. And through that, then I built a few parametric models that try to have all these geometrical trends. And at the start, it wasn't so successful in terms of being a useful space. So if you look at the left side, I actually have a assessment criteria, which is the space livability, the spatial hierarchy, and the geometrical system. So as I continuously improve the parametric model, then I finally arrive at a model which I feel has some sort of complexity and at the same time it's able to contain some of the geometrical trends that I spoke about. So this model is actually a layer of 5 polygonal Voronoi cells, and then they all stack up across the site to create some sort of fancy HDB for different sites. Then after I settled the parametric model, the next part was to look at how we can actually measure the climate performance of the building. So if we look at some of this data, some of it is distributed as a range of colors across the facade. But then when we input into the computer, it's not easy to account for all these distribution results. And so usually what we do in optimization is to combine it into a singular value in this way, and then we have an equalized common value for that design solution. So this is repeated for the 4 criteria that I've defined for this project. So one of it is the solar irradiation onto the facade. The second one is the wind that's flowing across the facade, and then we have the daylighting potential, and also the susceptible to glare. So the workflow goes like this. So there's always the data, and then what is the value of this data, and what is the appropriate action that we can apply when we know about the value of the data. So with the parametric model, we can extract this. This is what we see as the data, and then from there, when we uh, look at how we can assess it based on the climate conditions, then that is the value. And from the value, we can have action, which is to optimize how all these different options can be generated in a climately comfortable way. So because of how the results will be generated, it will create a very large design space, which means that there's just too many options for humans to physically look through, and it's going to be too tedious. So what I did was to create a customized visualization framework, and there are three main parts to it. And the aim of it is to really support design space navigation. So imagine that we have a design brief and we take on optimization as the design strategy. Then the framework will help us to select some good design solutions that meets certain environmental criteria. So so this Pareto front is something that comes out when we look into optimization. So let's say we have two objectives here, and then all these gray little dots are all the design solutions. The Pareto optimal solutions are the ones that naturally form along this curve, along this boundary of all these solutions, and all these are deemed to be the best, deemed to have the best allocation of resources, such that there's no way to improve on that solution further without compromising on another objective. So this is just the general idea of Pareto front. Basically, all these along the curve are the best solutions. So part one of that framework actually looks at setting up a four-dimensional graph because of my four design objectives. So the x-axis was the solar radiation, the y-axis was the useful daylight, and then the z-axis was the wind score. So all these little gray dots again were the solutions, and then I used the colors, the red to the green, to represent the last axis, which is the glare potential. And the way that I can extract this Pareto front across this four-dimensional surface is by using the mathematical concept of non-dominance. And then through that, basically we can extract any number of dimensions. So basically you can optimize across more than four dimensions, and then just apply this concept of non-dominance to extract all these best performing solutions. Then I took it one step further. I used a high dimensional clustering algorithm to find out what are the common geometrical trends that have the best performing geometry. And for this example, there were actually two main clusters, and then there were the outliers. So in this case, we can probably focus on these two clusters, and we know that the outliers probably happen once in a while, or it could be a calculation error, or it could be a extreme in one of the objectives. And then the part two of the visualization was a parallel coordinates plot, and it's just basically plotting all the individual solutions, but we include things like all the objectives, and we include all the genes that were included in the parametric model. And we can also apply the same coloring for the clusters, and through that we can see for each cluster where does it stand across the objectives and where does it stand for the genotypes. And the last part of the framework is to visualize all these spatial distribution of the results, because the computer is unable to compute it at speed. So is included at the end of the process, and you filter through the best performing ones before you study the way that the results are distributed on the surface. And then from there, you can have a better idea of where to place some of your spaces. Like, let's say if you need to have more greenery, it should naturally be placed on the places where the solar radiation is higher. But at the same time, you are able to see how the sunlight actually hits the interior floor plates, so you have a better idea of where to place some of all these common spaces. So this is just a recap of the 3 parts visualization framework. So first part, we look at the Pareto front. We can see how the objectives are placed in contrast to the other objectives. You can see how a solution fits and how the solution could potentially improve. And then second part is just all the raw data to help us to understand how to help us understand how the computer sees all these solutions. And the last part is the distribution of the spatial results. So now I have the framework and I have the parametric model. This is just a conceptual overview of how it actually helps with my selection of solutions. So at the start, this is all the possible solutions that are generated from the parametric model, and I call it the design space. And using the framework, I can approximate the Pareto front. So basically now there are less solutions in the design space. And then next, through the Pareto front, I can do clustering, and so it gives us some sort of meaning to the Pareto front. Like some of these are closer matched together, some of the others are not. And then through that, I can then have some selector options. So all these were based on just purely mathematics. And as a designer, I might be interested in some that are not so well performing but close to the Pareto front. So I can go back down using my framework, looking at the HDBs, looking at the clusters. I can select nearby ones. Then I can select the ones that are near the Pareto front. And through that, then I can have a better solution set that describes my design intent. So now that the framework is all set up, I try to continue this idea where I can use data to design almost everything. So I look at the map of Singapore, I look at the age distribution, look at population stats, and I try to using that, I try to select some sites where I can apply my algorithm. So I decided on 3 main sites. One is Hougang, one is Punggol, and then the other one is Queenstown. So I think something interesting about stats is that for Punggol, there are 2 main spikes in terms of the age group. One is the infants 0 to 4 years old, and there's another one that's about 30 to 34 years old. So I think it reflects the age that all these residents got their BTO, and basically this can be called a new town. And then for Hougang, there's also 2 mini spikes, one at 25 years old and one at 60 years old. So this is also reflected of the timing where Singaporeans actually moved into Hougang. And then the last one, there's Queenstown, which is the most mature estate. It's a very nice bell curve that is also similar to the bell curve in Singapore. So basically, I have a new town, I have a non-mature town, and I have a mature estate. And I applied, and then I went down to the site to just look at all the distinct characteristics of the site. So for Hougang, it's a very strong transport hub. From the images, I try to give the sense where it's a lot of movement, there's a lot of convenience store, there's a lot of all these common activities. And then for Punggol, it's next to the waterway, so it's very there's a lot of greenery, there's a lot of exercise paths. It's just green, and then there's just water everywhere. And then for Queenstown, it's a historical site. There are a lot of there's the butterfly block that's nearby. There are short bungalows nearby. So and at the same time it's a very dense area. So I try to reflect all these qualitative values as a designer, and I just apply the algorithm across the three sites just to look at how look at how the computer actually reacts to the site and what kind of geometrical trends actually fit for the individual sites. And then these are just some images of the solutions that are generated. And ultimately for my project, I selected this courtyard looking block. I think when I reached this point as a student, I was thinking, was I too ambitious, because this doesn't look like something that can pass off as a residential block if I were to put in the units. So then I went back to the parametric model again. I decided to study how we can actually squeeze rooms into the various shapes. And I started off by looking at just the geometry, but I realized that after a while, that it's more about the adjacency of the rooms. And then from the adjacency, then I fit it back into the block model. So this is one example of how it might look like. And there are, because of the way that the open spaces are constructed, when it's facing outwards, it could be function as balconies. When it's facing inwards, it could be functioning as a front courtyard. And then there's a common circulation strategy in the middle. And then I think I try to move on further and try to remove little holes in the building just to create more common areas. And the main strategy is to have a type of common area in the urban scale, in the block scale, tower scale, and then also on the module scale. So, so I think in conclusion, right, it's like I started off with some data. I generated all these different options, basically another chunk of building data, and then I use some constraints in terms of the climate conditions to filter down into some optimized typologies. And then from the unit side, I have some parametric models that generate the space adjacency diagram, and then I fit it into the extracted module to get floor plans that you can see in the left side of the slide, together with some pockets of spaces. So ultimately, this is how it might look like if it's built in right next to the project by I forgot who's the architect, but it's along the Pongo waterway, and then it gives like a it just fits there with the climate, and it also fits in with the surrounding blocks, and the way that the openings all open up both in terms of allowing common spaces and also allowing the wind through the site. So ultimately, this is a visualization of how the block spaces might look like, the common areas. And yeah, so I think with that, I think I come to the end of my talk. Thank you.
I think your form studies, when you had that done for the Punggol, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that one was actually quite interesting because you did mention whether it is a bit too complex for you to achieve it, right? But I think I mean, having gone through the rest of the processes of from start to end, I think when you come up to that, it's actually quite quite amazing to see how that somewhat derives into that kind of form, and how you actually then break it down to become something a bit more livable, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah.
But when you look at some of the, I think one of the diagrams or the model that you showed us with the spaces that were crafted inside that, right? I mean, there was one one floor that shows a model of the mm, yeah, the one before just now with the furnitures and things.
Okay.
Yeah, this one. Okay, your parametric model is one unit. When you have inward looking spaces like this, I mean, how would you then deal with that in terms of maybe say ventilation and things like that?
I think the way that I deal
Mm.
with it is quite is along the same thread as how the thesis was derived. So
Mm-hmm.
because after I did this right, then I realized okay, the middle could be a bit dark, could be a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why this strategy came about. So I
I
start
see.
to remove
A few
both.
things, yeah. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, even the
Mm.
modules also remove just to
Mm.
have some open areas lah.
Mm. Okay. This is a very interesting block strategy. I think because some of our second year students, I mean, for their second year projects, they were actually doing residential development. So the last round, they had residential and some mixed use as well. But I think this is actually quite a good strategy to actually make them analyze certain forms that they create and actually how it can become, to for different usage as well. I think this is, I would want to share this with them actually.
Sure.
Any questions from the floor for Liang?
Hi, may I know how long did this study take you?
So from start to end, it was about maybe 18 weeks for this. But if
Do you, sorry, is it safe for me to assume that you actually use Grasshopper and Rhinoceros software for this? Because it did look similar.
yes, I mainly use Rhino and Grasshopper. Then I also had some. I also exported some of the data out and then analyze it with Python. So it's a mixture lah.
Okay, and last question. Do you think that these softwares can be applied for perhaps a small-scale residential project, or do you think it's unnecessary?
I think the idea of optimization can be applied to smaller scale projects because before I was a PhD student, I was actually at DP Architects, and then I actually apply some of these same ideas to different types of projects. So there are some industrial buildings, there are some smaller scale annex buildings that try to maximize their roof for solar panels and all that. So basically, yes, it can be applied to any building design.
Okay, thank you.
Liang, your contact email is actually in your slides as well, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if there should be any follow up from anyone who doesn't want to ask Liang questions now, you can actually email him um, from his email to his email address. Okay, any more questions? No? If not, then I will end this webinar sharing. Thank you, Liang, for sharing and taking your time with us for your 30 minutes of sharing. I think it will benefit a lot of us already. Some of them, I think some of my students are also, some are here as well. You can benefit from that. If not, then your YouTube link will be sent to them as well. Okay, for the rest over here, there will be another webinar session on the 23rd of June next week. It's on artificial intelligence and some game engine, so it's going to be quite interesting as well. So do keep a lookout. It will be posted on the IBDC 2021 website, so just keep a lookout for that, and also at computation.space. Okay, So thank you again for attending, and thank you again, Liang. Thanks, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.